Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm joined in conversation by New York Times bestselling author Eric Rickstad. Eric's new release is the standalone suspense novel, I Am Not Who You Think I Am. It's about a young boy, Waylon Maynard, who witnesses a traumatizing event, the apparent suicide of his father, and then decides to investigate 8 years later. Consequently, he uncovers harsh truths and shocking revelations that cause him to question everything he thought he knew. It's a story of fractured families, fallible friendships, and the fateful decisions that come to define us. Eric lives in Vermont with his wife and children, where he writes his first drafts using a pencil and notebook, often while sitting outside in the woods. His previous works include Reap, which was a New York Times noteworthy novel, the three-book Canaan crime series, The Silent Girls, Lie in Wait, and The Names of Dead Girls, and, most recently, What Remains of Her. I Am Not Who You Think I Am marks the author's first book for Blackstone. Publishers Weekly called it an exceptional thriller and awarded the title a starred review, offering, knowing that the storyline is building toward the fatal conflagration keeps the tension high. Rickstad has raised his game to a new level. Further, Adrian McKinty, New York Times bestselling author of The Chain, praised the book as wicked and smart, everything you want in a great thriller. Now, join us as Eric Rickstad reveals how a singular image, that of a house burning in the night, eventually led him to write the twisty, turny, and entirely unputdownable I Am Not Who You Think I Am. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Central Booking. Today, I'm excited to be in conversation with New York Times bestselling author Eric Rickstad, whose newest thriller, I Am Not Who You Think I Am, and I'm going to flash you the cover because it's a really cool cover, is out October 5th from Blackstone. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you, John, so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. It's funny, we were discussing before we started recording that we've sort of been circling each other's worlds, at least on the internet, for a while now. So it's, fun to have a real-time conversation.
Yeah, it is nice. It is nice. It's good to be able to do this.
Yes, the whole new virtual world. This is the only way I see people anymore. It's kind of funny. Like, I don't know how to live outside of my computer.
It's so strange.
So anyway, I thought we could start by talking about the premise of this book, because it opens in, let's see if I don't say this wrong, Shireburn, Vermont, and the year is 1976. And there's a very fateful event that happens. 8-year-old Waylon Maynard, he comes home unexpectedly at lunchtime and witnesses something that's very traumatic. So can you tell us what that is and how that serves as the novel's inciting incident?
Sure. So, yeah, he comes home early from school. And as I write in the novel, 1976, nowadays a school and say, okay, well, you're not feeling well, you only live a few blocks away, just walk home. That would never happen. But that's what they did then. They sent you, go ahead. And so he comes home and his father's truck's there, and that's weird because he's usually working, and the door's open, and he goes in and the record player's playing, and he witnesses his father sitting on the edge of his bed. And this really isn't a spoiler because it's the very first setup, really. And he witnesses his father shoot himself. And when he steps a little closer to him, he sees a note, and the note says, I am not who you think I am. And he's so traumatized, of course, and he's devastated, and he's afraid, and he just hides the note. And that one act propels everything, that he keeps the note. His mother comes home, and the police are there and an ambulance is there, and she asks, is there a note? Is there a note? Is there a note? Right. Almost as if he looks upon reflectively, did she know this was coming? She was so insistent about, was there a note? And he keeps it from her. And then several years later, as a teenager, something happens where he thinks, was that even my father? Because the person he saw did have his back to him. And there's this one physical piece of evidence that starts to plague him, and he obsesses over. And he believes it means it couldn't have been his father there. But if not, where is his father? And he had assumed his father wrote this note. But if it wasn't his father, who wrote the note? Was it someone there who had read a note that was written by his mother or his father? So it creates this whole mystery for him to figure out what's happened to his father, if it was his father, what it all means. His mother also did something very peculiar immediately after following his father's death, which was to rid the house of every trace that his father even existed. The only things he has left from his father are things that he sort of stole from the curbside bins that she put him out in, or took before they could leave the house. A .22 revolver, which he regrets keeping, and his father's beloved books, and the note. And that's about all he has of his father. And it's really about a boy who wants to make sense of what happened and wants his father back. It's a thriller, but for me, it's a lot more than that. It's really about a boy who misses his father tremendously and will do anything to try to undo that moment and make sense of it. And that's really, to me, what the core is about emotionally. The thriller aspect is great, and page turner and all that. But to me, it's about this boy and his trauma and trying to reason with it.
Sure. I was going to ask you that a bit later, but I think I'm going to broach the topic now because, some writers do action very well. Some writers do emotion very well. And then, some of the lucky few do both very well. And I think that you're, among those because your stories tend to be really, high suspense, high action. There's a lot happening, but there's an emotional resonance to all of it. And I just wanted to ask you about that. Is that something that comes naturally? Do you find that you have to concentrate more on one than the other in developing it? How does that work for you?
They've started to dovetail more and more with the past few books. And my first book, Reap, had that too, though. I think about it, that was another novel that was about a young boy. And this is the first one I've written since that really involved someone younger. So they've both been in play. Sometimes one novel dictates that I have to work a little harder on the plot or the machinations of it, and making sure that there's, enough happening to keep the reader engaged. But at the same time, if you're emotionally invested in the character, then that's as good as action for me as a reader. There's some books you read just solely for the beautiful prose, and the emotional draw of it, that are written in a totally different way that I can appreciate. So I try to bring both of those to bear with each novel, that because I love to read both, and I love to read novels that have both. I think some other people that are known for writing, big thrillers have that element too, which I gravitate toward. Tanya French with her series, The Murder Squad. There's a lot of emotional investment and character development, and you read just for them, or Dennis Lehane's books, or Annie Proulx, or so many. Those are the ones I gravitate towards. So the long answer is it does come kind of naturally, because that's what I like in a novel myself as a reader. So that's what I try to do as a writer.
Sure. And it's interesting, but I was thinking about that because I was worried, am I going to remember this novel well enough to do a discussion, just because I read it 3 or 4 months ago. And so I've probably read 30 or 40 books since. And then as I started thinking about it, I was remembering a lot of it. And I think it's because of that emotional connectedness. Whereas when you read sort of the more formulaic books, I think they're a great read. They entertain you, but at the end of the day, they might be a bit more forgettable. Whereas something like this kind of, sears itself into your mind. One of the really interesting things about the story, I think, is the idea that grief manifests itself in different ways. And so you've told us a bit about, our Waynard, how Wayland, sorry, how he responds to the grief of his father, but we also see that in his mother and in his sister. So I was wondering if you can tell us, a little bit about who they are after the death of their husband, their father, and also sort of how that changes the dynamics of the family and how these three people relate to each other, or maybe don't relate to each other.
Yeah. There is sort of this, barrier between them all. They all move through the same small house. Where this, one of the ongoing traumas that, is kind of explored a little bit later, is that the mother doesn't get the son, doesn't get Wayland help. She doesn't get the sister help, or even herself. And they remain in the house where this happened. So this boy is constantly in the presence of where the most traumatic thing that ever happened to him is in his life every day. But it impacts the mother. She becomes solely, at least to Waylon's perspective, someone who she goes to work, she works hard, she tries to fight off being on the brink of poverty, basically. But in doing so, working double shifts at restaurants and leaving no time even for her personal life, except for one or two nights a week for bowling. Dedicates so much time to working financially to keep the family together that she's not there emotionally, that they like pass by each other, see each other briefly in the morning or in the evening. And the sister is traumatized in a different way. Waylon is sort of goes inward, and he becomes this reader, and he loves, Gothic fiction and Poe and gory illustrations. And, he has one friend basically. And he's lonely, but he's somewhat content in his little bubble, whereas the sister does things and behaves in a way that is more risky. She gets involved with some, she's younger than him, and she's about 15, and is involved with someone who's taking advantage of her situation. And I felt for her too, a great deal, and for the mother. But there are moments, I hope, that where things shift a little bit between those relationships. They have conversations and things change, especially for the sister and brother. I really wanted a couple scenes where that silence, that continued pattern between them is cracked open, and they can kind of reveal themselves a little bit more to each other. And he wants to protect his sister.
Right.
He's left being the older brother, but he's only a little over a year older than her. And it's too much for someone his age to think he can replace the father or whatever, but he feels this responsibility to protect her, and he can't. And it takes its toll on him, because he doesn't know what to do. He's still just a kid. But he loves his mother for sure, and he loves his sister, and they all love each other. But it's just that one event, disrupted everything.
Sure. And, the dynamics are so interesting, and particularly for mom and son, because there's so much suspicion of one another, because, she wasn't home when she would normally be home. And she's, of course, putting out all dad's belongings. And he's like, why is this? And then, of course, he's a teenage boy with emotional trauma. So why wouldn't she be suspicious of him? But it was just,
Right.
it was really well done. But then to sort of, in a way, offset sort of the family drama, he also has a really good friend, Clay, and then sort of a flirtation with a neighborhood girl named Juliet, who he goes to school with, and sort of helps him in his investigation. But even those relationships are sort of, they sustain him in a way, but they're also stressors for him. So I was wondering if you could talk about those relationship dynamics, because they're very interesting as well. And Clay, in particular, is an interesting character because he wants to be a good friend, but he doesn't necessarily show that in the way that probably Waylon would like.
Yeah. So Clay's much different than Waylon. Waylon's sort of this scrawny kid, very introverted and lonely and, shy and bookish. And his friend is, a star athlete, and he's, physically very attractive, and he has no problem with, dating and with interacting with, girls in high school, and Waylon can barely even make eye contact with, Juliet, who's she's sort of smitten with. But you're right, Clay, I think the reader sees that Clay he's a teenager too. And as much as he's seems to have it all, as an adult reader, you realize he doesn't, and he's just as lost in his own way, and he has issues with his own father at home. And it's just hard for a lot of this is about young boys too, and how do they communicate? How do they manage to actually speak the truth to each other? and really be there for each other instead of sort of performing these roles. And so sometimes Clay will be overly assertive with Waylon. He's constantly punching him in the shoulder, and Waylon's like, that really hurts. Like, don't
Yeah.
do that anymore. And okay, yeah. And there's sort of this not being aware really of both of how severe their situation is. And then there's miscommunication along the way, and also a fear from Waylon when the three of them get together, Juliet and Clay, that Clay will mock Waylon being smitten with this girl, or all Clay would have to do is snap his fingers or take off his t-shirt, and away he goes with Juliet.
Right.
That dynamic as teenagers. And then Juliet, she's sort of a mystery in some ways. We get to see her family life a little bit. Her father, and she talks about her family in a way that I wanted it to lend mystery, that there's something going on here in her life, not necessarily traumatic, but just that her family life's a little bit of a struggle as well. And there's, some upheaval there that she doesn't really want to share, but she genuinely, I think, as the reader will see, that, likes Waylon, and he doesn't need to be necessarily as insecure as he is about it, but he can't help but be. And that insecurity and lends to more miscommunication and more trouble as the novel goes along, because he really starts to distrust his only two friends as well, and find himself even more isolated through his obsession with trying to figure out what happened, and any disagreements that don't align with where he thinks this is going create suspicion for him, or anger, or feeling betrayed.
Sure. And, I found myself thinking, wow, this seems really realistic and reminiscent of those teen years when everything sort of gets blown out of proportion and you don't necessarily realize, that everybody is going through something. It may or may not be as big as the thing that you're going through, but there's, everybody has something hovering. And I really like that because obviously this is a book that's written for adults, but I think that it's a book that teenagers will also respond very strongly to because the characters seem so true to that life. And your ability, obviously, to still connect to those feelings, I think is pretty terrific, because then it gives all of us nostalgia. And then you realize how long ago it was that we were teenagers, and I'm like, oh my God,
I know, right?
That's scary. But I wanted to ask you too about the structure of the narrative, because it's written sort of as a manuscript. So the story opens in the 70s, mostly plays out in the 80s, and then several years later, this manuscript is written by somebody who wants to set the record straight and finally get the truth out there. And my question is just, why did this format appeal to you, and what do you think it is about the act of writing that really lends itself to confession or to catharsis?
Yeah, the original, the idea that there was, essentially, as a reader of the novel, the first thing you read is a letter from the local Shyburne police saying, we received this manuscript from this 50-some-odd-year-old man in the years 2020. And he's writing to say, like you said, set the record straight about this sort of infamous night in town where this mansion burned and people died. And this boy was believed to have perished. And this manuscript is the boy 30 years later saying, I didn't. And, this is the story. This is what happened. And that sort of just came out of the blue. It's one of those wonderful things, I think, because I think it works. And from what I can tell from the response so far, that framework works. I don't think it would have worked for me to write it like as the boy and it being just a couple years later. I knew there was something much more profound and dramatic that had happened, that this as sort of the little I don't know what you want to call it, but in the book cover, one secret, 8 cryptic words, meaning I am not who you think I am, lifetimes of ruin, that this affects him forever. And there's, it has impact. So the letter came out of the blue. And then I realized, oh, this is a manuscript that he's writing in retrospect about the events that led up to a certain night. And I think in part for him, for the narrator, it is cathartic. It is, it's him writing this to sort of try to make sense of even greater things that happened because of what he saw that day with his father. And I think sometimes it's cathartic to write, and sometimes it's not. There is this idea that it's cathartic, and you exorcise things, and but it really only goes so far. There's only so much you can write away. You can't write it all away. And I think, you can write as much as you want, and it can only be so cathartic in the end, which is, I think, part of the poignancy at the end too, of, certain revelations he has.
Sure. And I wanted to ask you about the ending too, and nothing spoilery. But I'm going to give it all away right now. Just kidding. But it's one of those really interesting books. There are a lot of complex storylines going on, and then you get to the end, and there's twists and turns all the way, and there's sort of this big shock, and your jaw drops, and then you think back, and you're like, wait, this was shocking, but also almost inevitable. And my question to you about that isn't the specifics of this ending, but I'm just wondering, as a writer, how much of the story do you know before you actually start writing it versus what develops naturally as you go throughout that creative process?
Yeah, I usually know very little. I have several strong images that I know are worth pursuing. I trust the process enough that, okay, this is an idea or this is an image worth pursuing. And then hopefully, sometimes the biggest hurdle for myself is finding that voice. And I think in realizing this is a manuscript written from an adult perspective, and that this boy was also steeped in, for his life as an adult too, steeped in books and steeped in libraries and Gothic books and everything about the love of libraries and the reverence for books that his father had and he has. So it's sort of almost, he knows how to write a book, because he's read so much. And I think I know very little. I have those two images. I had an image of a mansion burning because I grew up across the road from an estate in a town very similar to this one, that had a couple mansions and was on this lake, on Lake Champlain, and the view of the Adirondacks across. And one night, one of the homes burned out there, and then another, and a hay barn burned as well. And my sisters and I went out in our pajamas and watched this barn burn in the dark night. And that's always been on my mind. What can I do with that? What can I do with that? And that was 40 years ago. And then I had a friend that had a traumatic incident, actually very similar to what happened to this boy at the beginning, that led to a life of serious crime for my friend. And when we found out about how his life had gone, he was actually shot to death by the police. None of us knew the secret he had. And when we did learn of it, a lot of things made sense.
Right.
So anyway, long story short is that I know very little. And as I start to write, for me, part of the joy of writing and the challenge is to discover those things. So for instance, when Waylon comes home that day, I didn't even know until I started writing that scene that there was a note, which of course is the linchpin of the whole book. I just knew that he witnessed this thing, and I knew in the end it would lead to a mansion burning on an estate, but I had no idea how I was going to get there. But I just trusted, David Lynch says, trust your subconscious. And for me, that works. For some others, it doesn't. For me, that's how I like to go about it. And so when he looked and took a step closer to his father after his father had done it, that when he saw the note, I saw the note. When he turns the note over, I don't know what it's going to say till he turns it over. It's a very strange process for me, but I love it. he turned the note over and it said, "I am not who you think I am." And I said, "Oh boy."
There's a hook.
Now I'm in for it. So, but then as I write a draft and, things become clearer, I'll go back and I'll rework all those finer little things.
Sure.
So that reveals and stuff aren't so much these big out of the blue twists. They can be shocking or jaw dropping, but they make hopefully perfect sense. That you don't feel like you've been duped.
Right. Yeah.
That you feel like there are things in the book that suggested this all along, but still have a really, resonate really strongly with you, hopefully emotionally and, psychologically, and just as a reader, like, oh my, wow, sure. I can't, and there's a number of them as sort of tripwire, like a string of firecrackers in the last, 25 pages or so.
Right. And then you realize that the clues were sort of there all along. But I think that was also a great argument in the plotter pantser debate for, being somewhat of a pantser, because I think if you don't know what's coming next, then it's kind of hard for the reader to know what's coming next. And it also keeps the intensity up a bit.
I think some of that comes through in a good way, I hope, in that organic way.
Yeah.
I'm discovering as the characters are discovering, and maybe some of that comes through, even though I go back and hone it and make it as tight as I possibly can. So it reads well. That there's some of that comes through that, I know what's going on right here on the page, but I know there's a lot going on that I don't understand, and it's almost hard to put a finger on.
Right. I think you said it too. The word for it was organic. I even have that in my notes. It seems very natural and not contrived. Whereas sometimes you read something and okay, they had to do this to get that result.
Right. And I work sort of the opposite of that. Like, this is, what's happening, so this is what needs to continue to happen, rather than if I have the twist all along, then I'm just writing toward that.
Right.
And sometimes I'll read stuff that, I might like the book or whatever, but it feels like it's too much, reliant on one big twist or a couple big twists. And, the majority of the book is just working toward that, and it doesn't resonate with me as much. I'd rather have it be about the choices people make leading to certain revelations and a new understanding, which happens in our lives.
Right.
The reveals are about having new perspective on things that can feel like a real big mystery twist, but at the same time, are very natural to how we live life too sometimes.
Yeah, sure. And then it kind of reframes everything, and you're like, well, yep, that all makes perfect sense now. And before we move into broader territory, I did just want to ask you one more thing about this book, if you don't mind. One of the things that I really enjoyed is, it takes place largely in the 80s, so technology is not what it is now. So this investigation, you said there's this love of books and there's a love of libraries, and that comes through because, the work has to be done. You can't just call up Google, and get a quick answer. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about how setting this book, a couple decades ago allowed you to really explore that love of books and libraries that's changed a bit in the digital age.
Yeah, it has changed. We still love libraries, and I bring my kids to the library after school, and they love the library, but it's still changed. When I started writing about the card catalog, for instance, I realized how much, a lot of Wayland's love of the library is just my love, and the card catalog itself, and the old, especially the ones that were wooden and you slid them out. Sometimes they were always crooked and hard to push back in, and they smelled of the card stock, and the letters were, stamped right in there with the typewriter that, the librarian or whoever worked at the library had to type up. And it was almost secret messaging code with the brief, weird, mysterious, cataloging of it and then description. And I loved that. And I loved the smell of the library. And of course, the microfilm and microfiche, that you had access to rather than Google. You had to go down. And I remember looking up cool old stories about things that interested me down in the basement of the library is where they had the microfilm. And, it might've been something more mundane, like, some story about, the early days of how Springsteen was discovered or something, much more mundane than what he's looking for. But it's changed a lot, even the removal of the card catalogs and that type of thing. They were so mysterious to me. And so, I could spend a lot of time just sort of going through them. And so that was fun to do. And it was fun to do something where, everything's not at your fingertips.
Yeah, it was great. It was very resonant. I spent a lot of time, at the library as a kid myself, and I remember the card catalog very well. And now people are like, what? What is that?
Yeah.
Look it up.
Look it up on Google.
Yeah, look it up on Google. You'll see a picture and you'll be like, what? Great. All right. So moving into broader territory, if you don't mind. So, I think in recent years, you wrote 3 books that were part of a series that was connected more by place, but also some people peripherally. And then your last book was a standalone. This seems to be conceived as a standalone too. So I was just wondering if you can talk about the process of, conceiving a book like this, the liberties and the challenges of starting with a completely blank canvas versus writing a series where some of that framework is already in place.
Yeah. When the framework was in place for those others, that did in some ways make it easier, and a familiarity with those characters was helpful in writing the subsequent ones. And I feel like I have more of those in me as well. I want to continue to write about Sonia Test and Frank Rath and some of the others in those novels. But yeah, with this one, the voice again was hard to, nail down. I mean, I rewrote those first 25 pages dozens and dozens of times to try to find the right voice. And I think that, regardless if a pantser or outline, to me, the voice, if I don't have it, it's hard for me to find momentum to go forward and I had to do the same thing with the series too. I rewrote the beginning of The Silent Girls numerous times to figure out kind of who this Frank Rath is and where he's at, and what the right language would be, with the right tone and the right voice. So this one, presented as a new challenge in that I didn't know what that would be or how it should go. And it's kind of elevated language in some ways compared to those, and it has a Gothic tinge. And I wanted to sort of imbue it with a little bit of the novels he loves, a little bit of, Poe, a little bit of, Donna Tartt, or a little bit of Shirley Jackson, or a little, so that he sort of writes a little bit like that as well, but in his own voice. So that was the biggest challenge. I felt I always knew who he was, and I knew this kid well, and knew he was traumatized by this particular event. So it was really, figuring out the right voice for him, that balance between a kid, but writing it as an adult,
sure,
but not writing it in a way that was detached as an adult, but
sure,
still immersed you right in that sort of reflective mode he's in.
That's interesting. And, I think voice is so important, and it made me think back, and I realized that a lot of, my favorite books and the books that I remember well, it's more because of the voice and the character than the story. I can hear their voice. I might not remember, the specifics of the plot.
Right. Carlos Ruiz Zafón, The Shadow of the Wind, I think that was a book that, because there's also books that influence each book you write, and writers. And that one, I really loved that book. and I loved that character, and that explores books and libraries, and it takes almost entirely a place at night, it seems. you know
Yeah.
um,
It's
so
like, yeah, if you have a good voice and some literary references thrown in,
yeah.
I'm won over. I don't need
Yeah,
anything else.
yeah.
Um,
I'm a sucker.
totally. They know to send me those books. But let me ask you too. So you're a Vermonter. Your books tend to take place in Vermont, and I'm wondering if you can talk about how you see, setting or place as being important to story and how that helps you to build atmosphere. Because I think that your books are very atmospheric and very much so in a way that's specific to New England, that people who live in this area will say, yeah, there's that feel, there's that sound.
Yeah. You know, one is, this is where I grew up, where I live now. So that was initially where I would, start placing things for myself, in the stories that I wrote early on. But I've continued to write about it because I do love New England. I love books set in New England, and there's something about New England, just like there's something about the South. If you're a writer that grew up in the South, there's so much there to explore and mine that it'd be hard to break, from that. I mean, Stephen King's first, 15 books were set in Maine, and then he ventured out. Well, The Shining wasn't, but for the most part. So yeah, I love New England and the lore of it, and the Gothic feel of it, and the woods, and the small towns and the old buildings. They all lend to that atmosphere. There's history here. There's this feeling of, if not literal ghosts, but just deeper generations past than say the Midwest or the West, which have their own lore. But it's so specific to me that I haven't tired of writing about it in hopefully different ways. Like this one set more in the town. And it's a different town than, say, in the Silent Girls series or in What Remains of Her. Those tend to be set on the peripheries of really small
Right,
towns,
yeah.
where there's a lot of poverty or people living on the edge, and there's a darker feel to it than there is in this one. This one's sort of a mix of towns folks, and it's right in town. And there's the wealthy family up on the estate, and those things that don't get addressed as much. And I'll be writing and have written novels that will take place outside of Vermont as well. And in that case, they might be states I've been to or visited, and so I try to mine them in the same way. What's specific to them?
Sure. Yeah, and I love when you feel like you're actually crawling inside the story because you feel like you know this place. And I think, New England it seems sometimes very charming and quaint, but you can also realize that it's quite terrifying because you can be quite isolated.
Well, you can be isolated, and I've had an instance where I was threatened by someone in the woods when I was younger, and you realize there's no help here.
Yeah.
There's no, like, even where we are, we're in a small town, and we're right on we're not way out in the woods where, to some people we might be, but if something were to happen, we don't even have a local police force. We have the state police. So the nearest barracks is 25 minutes away.
Right.
And it might take 40 minutes for them to show up.
Yeah, there's a
long time to wait if something bad has happened.
Another reason to not be able to sleep at night.
And with this novel too, the Gothic element, if I look out my kitchen window, I can see Glastonbury Mountain, which is a place where four different people disappeared in the 40s and 50s in 5 years. And it's where Shirley Jackson based her second novel, about a girl who disappeared. And Shirley Jackson lived about 10 minutes from here, and Donna Tartt did too. So everywhere around here, there's that Gothic feel. I drive by Shirley Jackson's house once a week, and where she got the idea for the lottery, and where she wrote the Haunting of Hill House, and so many places that are mentioned in The Secret History are right here as well. And that mountain, I think, was Mount Cataract in The Secret History that I could see out my window. So that's always, there's the lore of other writers too that have mined the same area.
Oh, that's pretty awesome. There's some creative inspiration. Look out the window and see that. So I want to ask you too. So I don't know if you still do this, but I know in the past that you used to, write by hand, or at least your first drafts by hand. And I was wondering if you can, tell us about that. How do you think your writing benefits from that? And do you feel like a greater sense of connectedness when you're doing that versus working at a computer?
Yeah, so I do still do that for the most part, and I do feel much more connected from my imagination and my brain to the page. I use pretty much any notebooks I can get. My wife buys me some great notebooks, but I'll write in a spiral bound or a legal pad or whatever. I use a pencil. I really like the physicality of it, and I like how tactile it is, and I like being able to draw arrows and scratch out, something that's horrible, or, circle something and, indicate that it needs to move, or even doodle, when you're, or tap the pencil, put it in my mouth and chew on it and think, it's just a prop in some ways too. But there's a much greater connection from my imagination to the page when I do that. I'll then transpose it to a Word doc. I don't usually write the whole novel by hand and then go back. I, do a piecemeal. It might be not chapter by chapter, but just where I feel like, oh gosh, I got to get some of this in there. So that way, if I get stuck on writing, I can go back and massage something. But for the most part, it comes out much faster. And then I have to read my own handwriting and try to figure out. That's the biggest thing. I write so fast that way. Sometimes I even have a hard time reading my own handwriting. It's like reading 200 pages of a prescription written out by your doctor sometimes. But yeah, there's much, when I'm trying to write fresh new stuff on Word doc, and sometimes I do need to do that for whatever reason. If I get really stuck where it's just, I don't know what's going on today. It's just not, I'm not feeling it. It's not there. Many, many times I've just said, okay, I'm taking the notebook. I'm going outside. And it just starts to come. There it is. Like magic. I don't even know why, but it's there. And I just start writing and writing. Before I know it, I have, 15 notebook pages, whereas before I was just sitting there. And also it gets you away from the internet and all the trappings of that, which just I try to avoid as much as I can, other than doing what I do on social media for the books and for some fun stuff. But and I get to go outside with a notebook. I can write anywhere. I can be outside. I can be on my porch, or I can be next to a river, or I can, be at a coffee shop and do it outside. Whereas, a screen on a laptop in the outdoors is, they got to figure that one out.
Yeah, that's true. I kind of love that.
I know.
A few more questions and I will let you get back
to
your life. But I wanted to know, you mentioned you have 2 kids, so you are a father. Do you find that has changed your storytelling, or the types of stories that you want to tell or feel compelled to tell?
Yeah, definitely. This one had, there's the dynamic of the Wayland with his mother and the back and forth of that. And I was able to understand from her perspective, even though it's just written in his point of view of just what she's going through, just the commitment that is there for her. And then most of my characters have children, and they're really central to how they operate in their lives, what they think about, the opening scene of one of the novels. I think it's The Names of Dead Girls. Sonia Test is, she's in a store, a country store kind of place, getting, winter jackets for her kids when she gets the call, and for 3 pages, it's just her with her family and they're doing their thing. And that's important to me. So I'm able to write about that. And also the fear of having a child or children. You think about COVID and it's like, you do anything to have your kids. Well, most of us would, to not get COVID.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, um, and you'd rather get it yourself.
Mm.
You know, you'd rather die of it than have them suffer anything. So there's more profound connection to the brevity of life and the importance of every day, and then the wonderful joy of just being able to you know see each day be a different day for them. And so I try to get that into Frank Rath's connection with his daughter,
Right.
and Sonia Tess with her two kids, and what remains of her is centered around that because it's the disappearance of a wife and a child. um, so yeah, it's changed how I write a great deal.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. It's interesting. I don't have kids, I have cats, but I've become a caretaker to an elderly parent, which is similar in some respects,
Yeah,
but it changes your perspective on literally everything. So, I feel like I have a much better idea of what it is to be a parent because you don't see the world the same way, you don't make choices the same way. It's just really an interesting
yeah, yeah.
thing.
When you're caregiving, for your mom or whatever, yeah, it's very similar
Yeah,
in some ways. I had to do that with my mom, and
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it just definitely changes your world a
yeah.
bit. All right, so last two questions for you, and then I swear I'll let you go. You can get back to your notebooks. But I always ask for people who are tuning in who, maybe are starting down a creative path and are looking for some words of advice. If you could look back, what do you think is the best advice that you were ever given in terms of a creative or writing life? And then the best advice that you were never given, but sort of had to figure out for yourself, in going through the process of actually doing the writing.
Yeah, so the best advice I've gotten along the way, um, is to keep at it, to keep writing, keep reading widely and broadly, even stuff that has no um, connection to what you're trying to write, because somehow it will be connected. There might be something you discover along the way about what a certain writer does, or how she or he does it, and to accept rejection as par for the course. That writing and publishing are totally distinct things from one another in a lot of ways. So I think to keep at it and to find the right readers for you early on, as far as getting feedback early. Don't knee jerk respond to every issue some reader might have early on, like, wow, this didn't, get it as fully developed as you can. And then find a friend or a fellow writer or someone who appreciates and understands what you're trying to write, so that they don't try to rewrite it in how they do or how they want it. They understand what you're doing, so they can help inform you to do that better rather than rewrite it a different way.
Sure.
And then the advice that I didn't get, that I think I had to figure out on my own, I would say to trust the process of writing. That there's going to be times where it doesn't come nearly as easily. It seems like it should, but I think I picked up on it pretty early on. But when you're first starting out in writing, sometimes everything just comes, and even if it's bad writing, you're writing. It's just there. I think that happens a lot with a lot of artists. There are a lot of people that are musicians and stuff. You look at the
Right.
arc of a career of um, bands and musicians, and they're early, 2-3 bang, they had 4 great albums or whatever, and then life invades too, and other things. But I think just trust the process wherever you are in life, that the story will get there if you sit down every day and work at it.
Excellent advice. And final question to you, since we've talked about, what you have out right now, can you leave us with a little teaser about what we might expect next from you?
Yeah, so I've finished one novel, and this is a departure again, and it doesn't take place in Vermont. It takes place across the country, and it's about an FBI agent who is investigating the strange and seemingly entirely disconnected murders of families across the country, and he's forced to work with someone he doesn't want to work with, and it sort of subverts the whole narrative, the whole pop culture idea of profiling.
Wow.
That we've been inundated with this idea that profiling works. From Red Dragon all the way up through, and then Mindhunter, the TV series, which I love, which is the beginning of that. This is really kind of like the guy, the character in that who isn't so trusting of it. This FBI agent sort of subverts the whole idea of what pop culture has done with profiling. He has no use for it. I've spoke to numerous FBI agents, and they said, it's useful, but
when it works,
but it's not. It's never helped catch anyone.
Right. Wow, great.
Ted Bundy, a broken tail light. Son of Sam, a parking ticket.
It's true.
The BTK, basically 20 years later starts writing notes to the police. I'm still here. You haven't got, well, it's taking you so long, and the idea that, in the novel, he says, look at Ted Bundy. If we had profiled him then, we would have had a loser in a basement that was probably, deformed and didn't have a job and reflected the depravity that he demonstrated in his crimes. He matched none of that. And it doesn't mean that profiling can't match. Once you arrest the person, oh yeah, that fits.
Right.
But did it actually help you arrest the person? And so this person he's working with is sort of leagues beyond what profiling is. He's sort of a remote viewer that thinks he can see events and people from a distance, using a vision of sorts. And this guy wants nothing to do, but together they have to work it out.
Wow. That's very intriguing. You've given me something to look forward to. It's nice to have things to look forward to these days. And in the meantime, of course, people need to go out and pick up I Am Not Who You Think I Am, which will be out October 5th. It's a terrific read. Eric Rickstad, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, John. I've looked forward to this for a while, so thanks.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.